I'm James McIlvenney, and you're listening to the History and Philosophy of the Language Sciences podcast, online at hifilangsci.net. There you can find links and references to all the literature we discuss. In this episode, we continue our exploration of the place of meaning in language study by looking at what was happening in Britain in the first half of the 20th century. We'll focus in particular on the leading British linguist of this period, John Rupert Firth, and the notion of context of situation, which he adapted from the work of Bronisław Malinowski, one of the pioneers of modern ethnography. This ethnographic angle is perhaps one of the main features that sets British linguistics apart from the predominantly German historical comparative research on Indo-European that we've mostly looked at so far. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, Britain was the largest colonial power in the world, and a major task for British linguists was documenting and teaching the exotic, in inverted commas, languages of their colonial frontiers. As we discussed in episode 9, for the neo-grammarians and their allies in Indo-European linguistics, the importance of living spoken language came as something of a revelation to these scholars traditionally concerned with ancient texts and archaic inscriptions. By contrast, living languages, and languages quite different in structure from the usual European model, were the starting point for many British linguists. Firth's career was directly entangled with the affairs of the British Empire. In 1914, he went to India to work for the Indian Education Service. During World War I, he joined the British Army and served in various regions of India and East Africa. His first major academic appointment, in 1919, immediately after the war, was as Professor of English at the University of the Punjab in Lahore. He returned to England in 1928 and worked for around a decade, mostly at University College London, before he moved to what was then the School of Oriental Studies, and is now the School of Oriental and African Studies, where he became a professor in 1944. The expertise in Indian languages that Firth had acquired in his time on the subcontinent was one of the reasons he was offered the positions in London. And the School of Oriental and African Studies, as the name suggests, was founded with the explicit purpose of training British civil servants in the dark arts of colonial administration. Firth and his fellow linguists at SOAS provided training in the languages and cultures of the peoples they would soon be sent out to govern. But Firth himself we could perhaps describe as an ambivalent imperialist. He made his career within the structures of the British Empire, but he didn't necessarily have a condescending attitude to the empire's colonial subjects, their cultures and languages. He even spoke about de-Europeanizing himself, about broadening his linguistic and intellectual horizons through his contact with non-European cultures. He called India the home of phonetics and acknowledged the inspiration he derived from traditional Indian linguistic doctrines in developing his own ideas. Firth's attitude perhaps derives in part from his own comparatively humble origins. He was from Yorkshire and had studied at the University of Leeds. In a sense, he also came from the periphery of the British Empire and had to acculturate himself to the language and norms of its elites. With his beginnings as an English professor in India and then expositor of the languages of the colonized in Britain, the foundation of Firth's linguistics was highly practical, oriented towards such real-world applications as language learning and teaching. A consequence of this orientation is that Firth was first and foremost interested in language in use. Let's now turn to the key manifestation of this in Firth's work, his notion of the context of situation. We should preface the following discussion with the observation that Firth never really set out a definitive version of his doctrines in a single work. Rather, he developed his ideas, often with a great deal of repetition, across numerous smaller papers and talks, the most significant of which were collected in volumes in 1957 and posthumously in 1968. He did write 2 books in the 1930s, which were directed at a general popular audience. These books, Speech and The Tongues of Men, offer up some of his ideas in a slightly livelier and more accessible form. The exposition of Firth's ideas that I offer now is a pastiche of these sources. All the direct quotes are taken from papers in the 1957 and 1968 collected volumes. According to Firth, the principal objective of linguistics is the study of meaning in its own terms. Meaning, on Firth's understanding, is the function of a linguistic form in a specific context. The true object of study for the linguist is the individual utterance in the context in which it is made. Firth's view represents a reversal of the Saussurean orthodoxy that had already become established by the 1920s. As we'll recall from episode 12, Saussure is generally interpreted as saying that the proper object of study for linguistics is the langue, the abstract system of each language, while the application of langue to make utterances, the parole, merely represents manifestations of this system and is not amenable to scientific treatment. Firth, with explicit reference to this interpretation of Saussure, argued that it's only actual instances of language that are real, and the abstractions that linguists make are just that, mere figments of analysis. According to Firth, every aspect of language, from the sounds to the structures of words and sentences to the way we interact in conversation, is imbued with meaning, and the task of the linguist is to analyze these various facets of language in context. There's no single monolithic analysis that can be performed. Rather, as Firth wrote, descriptive linguistics is a sort of hierarchy of techniques by means of which the meaning of linguistic events may be, as it were, dispersed in a spectrum of specialized statements. To exemplify his approach, Firth takes the linguistic form bored, which he analyzes in terms of 5 different functions. The first of these, the phonetic function, is constituted by the sounds of the language in the context of other sounds, the way they can be strung together and replaced. For example, Firth counts 15 alternative vowel sounds that can potentially contrast with the or of bored. These would produce such alternative forms as bead, bid, bed, bood, bud, and so on. The next function is the lexical function, the way that the contrast between sounds serves to distinguish one word from another. For example, board could contrast with cord, or bought, or port. The next level is then the morphological function, the contrast of the form with other forms that belong together in a morphological paradigm. If we look again at board, Firth observes that there are several different paradigms that this form could belong to. There is first of all a paradigm that consists of board and boards. There's a second paradigm that would be board, boards, boarded, boarding. A third paradigm, bore, bores, bored, boring. In the first paradigm, bored is a noun, allowing for singular and plural inflection. In the second, it's a verb with different tense and agreement inflection. And in the third paradigm, bored is a past tense form of a different verb, which has the base form bore. On the face of it, what Firth has to say about the phonetic, lexical, and morphological functions sounds very much like standard distributional analysis, as employed by his contemporaries. We've already seen this kind of analysis when we looked at phonemic theory in European structuralism in episode 15, and we'll see distributional analysis refined to a mechanical method in the work of Bloomfield and his Circle in America in future episodes. But Firth's methods of analysis, especially in phonology, actually differed quite a bit from his contemporaries. A detailed discussion of these points would take us too far away from the central topic of this episode. But in short, Firth was dissatisfied with the phoneme as the ultimate unit of phonological analysis. He felt that it put too much emphasis on the segmental aspect of phonology and was the result of elevating the principles of alphabetical writing of the Western kind to a theoretical axiom. Firth developed an alternative approach of prosodic phonology that recognized prosodies as first-order units of analysis that interact with segmental units. If we now return to Firth's functional analysis, we find that with the fourth and fifth functions, we start to enter the realm of meaning as we would usually conceive of it. These are the syntactic and semantic functions, as Firth called them. The syntactic function is essentially the type of utterance without specific situational information. For example, if we were to add intonation to bored to produce bored or bored, then we can tell what type of utterance it's supposed to be, something like an exclamation or a question. Finally, with the semantic function, we arrive at the context of situation. If I were to say bored, you might reply no, or not really, or go on. Each of these replies serves to situate the utterance in a specific conversational context. So Firth's method involves abstracting away different aspects of language to determine their meaning in their respective contexts, with a very broad sense of the word meaning. The apex of his hierarchy of analytic methods is the semantic meaning, the utterance considered in a specific context of situation. But what constitutes the context of situation? Firth says that we need to take the following things into account. First of all, the relevant features of participants, the persons and personalities involved. Then the verbal action of the participants, what they're saying. Then the non-verbal action of the participants, what they're doing. The relevant objects in the environment. And the effect of the verbal action, what they do as a result of what they're saying. Firth observes that we can classify different contexts of situation and pick out the language that is typical of each of them. He points out that this is essentially what is done in language textbooks, where a lesson might be based around a situation like traveling by train. The book will supply the relevant vocabulary, grammatical constructions, and dialogues exemplifying the standard conversational scripts that we follow in such a situation. Carving out a restricted language reflecting specific situations like this is the ideal path to linguistic analysis, according to Firth. Firth and his colleagues put these principles to work in the service of the British Air Ministry in World War II when they analysed typical radio communications of Japanese fighter pilots to produce a crash course in Japanese for British intelligence officers. Graduates of the course were able to eavesdrop on Japanese radio communications and identify the signs of reconnaissance missions and imminent bombing raids. But the context of situation is not merely a matter of the immediate physical environment in which a language is being used. It's also a matter of the broader culture in which that language is embedded. The cultural aspect was even more prominent in Malinowski's version of context of situation. Malinowski, in fact, coined the term context of situation in an essay called The Problem of Meaning in Primitive Languages, which he wrote as an appendix to the 1923 book The Meaning of Meaning by the English scholars C.K. Ogden and I.A. Richards. Malinowski later expanded on this work in his 1935 book Coral Gardens and Their Magic. So let's look at Malinowski's version of context of situation, relying mostly on the outline he gives in his 1923 essay. Here, Malinowski sets out a theory of meaning and language developed in response to his ethnographic fieldwork in the Trobriand Islands of New Guinea. By the time he set out for the Trobriand Islands in 1914, Malinowski was at the London School of Economics, where he completed his postgraduate studies and would later become professor. But Malinowski was originally from the Polish city of Krakow, which at the time of his birth in 1884 was ruled by Austria. He was an ethnic Pole, but an Austrian citizen, and when World War I broke out, he was obliged as an enemy alien to stay in the Pacific during the course of the war, dividing his time mainly between his field site in the Trobriand Islands and Melbourne in Australia. Malinowski's reflections on meaning are shaped in particular by the difficulties he faced in bridging the cultural gulf between the Trobriand Islanders and himself as an European interloper. As the title of his essay alerts us, The Problem of Meaning in Primitive Languages, his account is bound up with all sorts of colonial prejudices about the differences between so-called civilized peoples and savages. Without wanting to be an apologist for Malinowski, I should note that his attitudes were at the more progressive end of the spectrum for his time. Although he continually invokes a contrast between the civilized and the primitive, he never fails to point out the similarities between these two assumed poles, how much of the supposedly primitive remains part of the fabric of allegedly more civilized societies. Malinowski invites us to imagine ourselves in his place as a European trying to understand the language of the Trobriand Islanders. He writes in his essay, "Imagine yourself suddenly transported onto a coral atoll in the Pacific, sitting in a circle of natives and listening to their conversation. Let us assume further that there is an ideal interpreter at hand who, as far as possible, can convey the meaning of each utterance, word for word, so that the listener is in possession of all the linguistic data available. Would that make you understand the conversation, or even a single utterance? Certainly not." Malinowski wants to make the point that knowing the meaning of the words is not enough. We must also know about the actual situation in which they were uttered and the broader culture in which they are embedded. These two factors are more apparent when dealing with a language like that of the Trobriand Islanders. Their language is unwritten, and so every utterance is more directly bound to the immediate situation than a text in a written language, which must be framed in such a way that it can be detached from its immediate situation. But even more importantly, the great cultural difference between us and the Trobriand Islanders means that the significance of much of what they say will simply escape us. To illustrate his point, Malinowski offers a statement in native, as he puts it, with a morpheme by morpheme interlinear gloss. The gloss runs, "We run frontward ourselves. We paddle in place. We turn, we see companion ours. He runs rearward behind their sea arm, Pilolu." This statement recounts an episode from an overseas trading expedition where the teller of the anecdote is boasting about having raced ahead in his canoe and leaving behind his companion in another canoe. The expressions frontward and rearward refer to the canoes and their relative positions. They do so using culturally specific metaphors. To appreciate the significance of the reference to their sea arm Pilolu, we similarly need to have knowledge of the local geography and the relation of the people to it. And above all, we need to know about the competitive character of Trobriand culture in order to understand the point of this anecdote. The teller is boasting of his exploits. Malinowski's method for trying to make such wholly foreign texts accessible to his culturally European audience was to first provide a written transcription of the text, accompanied by a literal interlinear gloss, like the one that we just read out. This was then followed by a detailed explanation in English of the content, context, and significance of the text. So this notion of the context of situation, as it was developed by Malinowski and adapted by Firth, might remind us of the situation of speaking introduced by Philipp Wegener, which we talked about in episode 17. Malinowski did in fact cite Wegener as one of his inspirations, and Firth was even more forthcoming about the debt that he, Malinowski, and other like-minded scholars owed to Wegener's pioneering work. The similarities between Malinowski and Wegener become even more apparent as we read Malinowski's account of the genesis and development of language. Malinowski insists that the most basic use of language is as a mode of action. He contrasts this to language as a condensed piece of reflection, a record of fact or thought, a use which is characteristic of modern science and literature, and which is a later derivative use of language. Malinowski provides a catalogue of situations in which language can be seen to be primarily a mode of action. First of all is language in action, where language is used to coordinate the activities of people to achieve some practical end. Here he offers the example of language used to coordinate the behavior of participants in a fishing expedition. Next, Malinowski mentions the narrative situation, such as the example we quoted just a moment ago, in which the speaker recounted their exploits on the trading expedition. Even this narrative use of language is a kind of action, argues Malinowski. It is social action, intended to inspire feelings of pride or mortification, triumph or envy in those present. The purest form of this kind of social action through language is what Malinowski calls the phatic communion. Idle chatting and gossip, he observes, has merely the function of bringing people together. The literal meaning of what is said is actually quite irrelevant. This function of language can be seen in so-called primitive societies just as much as in the intercourse between Europeans, who will greet each other with, "How do you do?" This question and the answer are in fact irrelevant. It's merely a pleasantry that is exchanged habitually. The same principle applies to aimless conversations about the weather. In Malinowski's notion of social action, we can detect shades of Wegener, who also highlighted the primary role of language as a means to influencing other people. Also like Wegener, Malinowski anchors his account in the development of language in children. For a child, language is first and foremost a way of effecting action in the world. A cry of "Mama" summons the mother. When the child is hungry or uncomfortable, a suitable cry will cause the situation to be remedied. According to Malinowski, this is the first of 3 stages through which language develops. At this first stage, the utterance is nothing but a reflex-like reaction that correlates with a specific situation, but which does not involve any thought. But at the second stage, an articulated or semi-articulated sound is actively produced to refer to a specific thing in this situation. Then, at the third stage, 3 different fundamental uses of language emerge. There's, first of all, speech in action, where language is used to coordinate an activity and actively handle things in the world. But then there is narrative speech, where the things being talked about are not immediately present, but the reference to them is mediated by an act of imagery. Finally, there's the language of ritual magic, where a ritual act supported by a traditional belief creates the link between what is said and its assumed effect in the world. The language of magic is one of the central topics in Malinowski's Coral Gardens and Their Magic. A large proportion of the texts reproduced in this book are magical spells designed to promote agricultural success. Magical language, argues Malinowski, is merely adults' attempts to replicate the experience of their earliest childhood. Magical spells seek to bring about change in the world in just the same way that the child uses language to summon its caregiver and secure relief from its problems. This belief in the magical power of language is observable even in supposedly civilized communities, says Malinowski. The way Malinowski frames the discussion in his appendix to The Meaning of Meaning ties it in with the broader themes of that book. Ogden Richards' book reflects the preoccupation with the problem of meaning that was characteristic of the educated classes at this time, especially in the English-speaking world, but also in other European and Europeanized countries. We already caught a glimpse of this motif in the last episode, when we spoke to Walter Schmitz about Victoria Lady Welby and her circle. In The Meaning of Meaning, Ogden and Richards were concerned with what they called word magic, the supposed superstitious belief in the power of words, which they thought still influences modern attitudes to language and can lead to dire consequences, such as irrational thinking and manipulative propaganda. Their book set out to combat this problem of word magic by exploring how words mean. Ogden and Richards offered their own functional model of language, with a primary division between what they called the referential and the emotive uses of language. The referential use is supposed to be how language is employed in science and philosophy, a detached representation of rational thought. The emotive functions, on the other hand, include devices for expressing attitudes towards the thing being spoken about or the listener, ways to appeal to the listener to try and sway their opinion, expressions designed to assert the certainty or authority of the speaker, and so on. In his appendix to their book, Malinowski took on aspects of Ogden and Richards' language critique, while at the same time trying to reform their model by decentering reflective, scientific language and emphasizing the fundamental role of primitive language in action. Firth did much the same thing in his writings, often with explicit reference to Ogden and Richards, among other authors. Ogden and Richards' work was also applied in a sense. They argued that the emotive aspects of language often unwittingly encroach on the referential function and can thereby interfere with rational thought. They offered a method of definition to unpack the meanings of words and show us what they really mean, while at the same time weeding out any emotive elements. Being clear about what we mean, they said, will prevent us from getting caught up in fruitless arguments in which we're in fact talking about different things. And excising the emotive will ensure that we stay cool-headed and rational. A desire for language therapy of this kind is characteristic of this era and crops up in a number of forms. In incipient analytic philosophy, for example, there was an emphasis on decomposing propositions into their logical components and translating these into verifiable statements in an effort to be clear about their meaning and to test their validity and truth. We might also look to the international language movement, which was at its height in this period. The primary aim of this movement was to introduce a single language for international communication, but it was widely held that the international language should be one that was specially engineered to encourage precise rational thought. And in much writing on political discourse from this era, there is a marked discomfort at how language is twisted and distorted to manipulate people for certain political ends. The most famous author in this regard, who's become part of our popular culture even today, is George Orwell. The newspeak of his 1984 is in part a parody of the excesses of the international language movement, including the later work of Ogden to develop a simplified and refined basic English for international communication. I've examined these projects and the spirit of this era in excruciating detail in my 2018 book, Language and Meaning in the Age of Modernism.